Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming on this really wintry night tonight. It feels wintry. Thanks so much for coming. I am incredibly honored to be hosting Kiki Petrosino here tonight, and also just so pleased that Kiki could join us to be this year's visiting Cromwell poet as part of our programming this year. And for those of you out there enjoying the live stream, thank you for joining us online as well. The way tonight will work is Kiki will be introduced by Smith student Isabel Cruz. And then following Kiki's reading, Kiki will be in conversation with Layla Shati, who I'm sure many of you know is this year's Conkling Poet in Residence. So we'll get to hear a moderated conversation between the two of them. And then right after that, Kiki will be signing books right over here. So please, there's books for sale in the back, thanks to Broadside Books, our local independent bookstore that we partner with for these readings. And so please, all of Kiki's books are for sale back there. And then even if you want to just come up and say hello and drop Kiki a line in person right here, please come and do that as well. As always, I just have a few quick announcements. I want to thank our tech team, Dan, Jeff, and Tom, who are bringing live streaming via YouTube and Facebook channels. I want to remind my English 112 students to please sign in. If you could, just please remember to silence your cell phones. And then the last announcement, we are coming to the end of our fall season. We only have one poet left this season. December 6th, we'll be welcoming and hosting Carrie Fountain right here to, let's see, 7 o'clock in Weinstein. So please join us for that last event. I'm really looking forward to that reading. It should be a wonderful night. It is now my pleasure to introduce Isabel Cruz. Isabel Cruz is a current junior at Smith College, completing a double major in American Studies and English on the creative writing track with a concentration in poetry. You may know her from today's incredible reading and performance of Maven during, exactly, it was really amazing. Outside of her pursuits in academia, she's a core intern at the Boutelle-Day Poetry Center, where she is known for her all-around awesomeness and everything that she does there, and she is a performance poet. She regularly travels around along the East Coast to perform and has done so in venues such as the Patterson Poetry Festival and Newark Arts Festival. Please welcome to the podium, Izzy Cruz.
Thank you, Matt, for that awesome introduction. It is my absolute pleasure and greatest honor to introduce to you the incomparable Kiki Petrosino. When Matt asked me if I'd be interested in doing tonight's introduction, I will admit, absolutely petrified. Yet because of the caliber of this poet, I jumped at the chance. Today not only brings us the promise of a fantastic night of poetry, it is Cromwell Day, the day during which we at Smith College honor Otelia and Adelaide Cromwell, the first Black graduate and first Black faculty member of Smith College, respectively. I could think of no better poet than Kiki Petrosino on a day such as this, where we not only celebrate the accomplishments and legacies of the Cromwells, but all Black students and scholars everywhere who have fought for equity and equal opportunity since, of which Petrosino is a shining example. Upon reading Bright, I was immediately captivated by the clarity and luxury of the prose. Never before had I read a memoir where the images were so tangible that I, too, could, quote, discern the promise of rain as if it were a feeling inside my body, end quote, as Petrosino's narrator does in the very first vignette. A moment so fleeting yet resonant that I would be remiss in not pointing out is the very brief inscription under the vignette heading for The Mirror. The inscription reads, "You don't need white people's approval to be happy," the Mirror said. "But if you want anything from their world, they have to like you." My own personal experience as a student of color who had attended parochial school for 12 years latched on to these two semi-Alice in Wonderland-like sentences that go on to frame Petrosino's narrative. Although charged with heartache, Petrosino strives to find something beyond the bounds in which white supremacy and Catholic dogma have placed her. Her refusal is clear and resounding. Quote, "I won't divide my vestments into purple and green, my calendar into days of obligation and ordinary time," end quote. Petrosino will not live life nor classify others in neat trellises dictated to her as law, papal, societal, or otherwise. On page 57, Petrosino writes, "I have always envied Haney's ability to root down into multiple traditions of belonging, culture and poetry, faith and poetry, country and family and poetry. Yet she does exactly that in negotiating a unique positionality between the intimate and the societal, the personal and the cultural. In just one of these moments, Petrosino creates a masterfully linked web between Shakespeare's Prospero, her grandfather, and passages from Dante's Inferno that have an even deeper resonance when examined within a legacy of racial trauma and resentment. It is in these intersections that Bright comes to profound realizations about personhood, family, love, and human nature. In addition to her stunning memoir, Bright, she's the author of Fort Red Border, 2009, Hymn for the Black Terrific, 2013, Witch Wife, 2017, and White Blood, A Lyric of Virginia, 2020. She earned a BA from the University of Virginia, a Master's in Humanities from the University of Chicago, and an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. She co-founded the journal Transom and is the Director of Creative Writing at University of Virginia. Petrosino is the recipient of a MacDowell Artist Residency, a Pushcart Prize, a Fellowship in Creative Writing from the National Endowment of the Arts, the UNT Rilke Prize, and the Spalding Prize, among other honors. Please join me in welcoming the poet of the hour, Kiki Petrosino.
Thank you so much, Izzy, for that thoughtful and, just such a sensitive and wonderful introduction. Thank you, Matt. Thanks for inviting me to come do this. This is my very first visit to Smith, so I've received such a warm welcome, and I'm just so delighted to be here. I am going to start by reading something that I don't usually read, which is a sonnet sequence that appears in my latest book of poetry, White Blood, A Lyric of Virginia. A sonnet cycle, or what we might call a crown of sonnets, traditionally is a grouping of 7 sonnets that all have resonating lines in between each one. And so that's like a regular sonnet crown. If you want to make a double sonnet crown, you can do like 14 sonnets. So it's a sonnet of sonnets, and they're all linked in between with resonating lines. You can also do a heroic crown, which is what I overachieved myself into for this book, which is 15 sonnets, in which you do the sonnet of sonnets, and then the 15th sonnet is made up of the repeated lines from the previous poems. So you'll hear some of the same phrases repeat and kind of turn in different ways. I'm going to read this. Sonnet, heroic crown of sonnets, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think that more than anything, in this particular book, it talks about the experience of being in college and being an undergraduate. For me, my college experience, my undergraduate experience happened at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I think it's kind of important before thinking about looking at the memoir to kind of think about, again, how it feels to be an undergraduate student, how it feels to be in college, how it feels to be a person of color on a predominantly white campus. The other reason that I'm going to read it is because Charlottesville and the University of Virginia are on my mind tonight, after what happened, the loss of 3 wonderful students, 3 student athletes, in a terrible act of violence that happened on Sunday. This poem is called Happiness. In, I got in. That is, inland, to to the inmost place, my university. Blue ink on the letterhead, orange slit in my thumb, in the innards of each finger pad so deep you cannot prize me out of my acceptance. How I prized the letter they let me in with, into that indwelling spot where I grew like a braid, in bad light, in some bind, honors of honor, my crown grew all season, circlet of torches blooming on the hill. Blooming across hills, I was a girl of blooming sense, of slip and colored sedge, a floret. The stem of my neck spiked up from my lanyard, my head leaned and looped sunward. Back then, my body filled a chair, plant body, water body, back then in that weedy way, seed girl, scholarship girl. Blade upon blade upon blade, a cavalier grows. In here, the colonnade clink of goblets. A cavalier loves her universe, slashes shadowed stripes. She looks center right or center justified. She seeks that middle note some never reach, white heart of the page where distinguished men appear in battalions of charm. They will not speak to thee. How to write with only thick white ink and not be thought a cheat. We think and think, we think and think and think. To think of those white kids whose turn some said I took. I took it hard, my turn, my breath, my package of aid. I made a massive shape mid-traipse across the lawn or hunched at lunch. I ate the beautiful books I bought with borrowed funds and swallowed down the two-ness one ever feels. My body's debt, silent slab. I knew I was a living lab. Since I was a living lab, I scythed skull clean my crop of hair. I buttoned up my button-downs like tarps and hummed in botanical Latin the notes of my glasshouse erudition. Now, I can't stop counting these dents in my ribs, system of stinging whorls, tiny rosettes stelled in my side, for I leaned so long against that trellis, what I took for petals were scars. What I took for petals were scars. What I thought was Jefferson Park Avenue. At 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, what I thought was just Tuesday was my grandfather in Brooklyn looping the cord about his neck, testing its clear tensile metal before he hanged himself. What happens when the beloved body hangs up its flowers? Every flower falls over the top of the door. At the choir leader's door, I hung, offering guests chilled shrimp bites, woodsy darts of rosemary. I waited with the tray she'd given me and peered back through her faculty pavilion. Arrangement of deepening grids, silver, silver, silk, one whole chamber just for books. With my eyes, I robbed it bare. No one saw me chomp the chandelier. It went down a carnival onion. My jaws grew salt sharp and strange. Let my jaws be his salt shovels. Let my eyes be his cannonball clock. Let my feet be the dark birds he keeps in a cloud. Make my chest his china berries, their medicinal ring. Make of my side his smokehouse smell and my arms his lettuce dipped in French light. Turn my scalp blue from the smoke of his fires. My debts at lunch, let them be his glass doors. Turn my neck into his turning buffet. Ain't my breath his dumbwaiter loaded with wine? Ain't my thoughts his nail rod, his ice house, his pond? Look at my skin, nearly shell-edged. Oh, still, this rattle, my heart, bone dominoes at night, this rasp in my heart, red leather, his swiveling throne. Ha, ha, my heart, red feather of joy, ha, academical village, ha, ha, diversity, ha, direct loans, ha, ha, poetry, ha, 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 Eurydice's pierced foot, and ha, my ears pierced with white stars, ha, thesis, ha, 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 distinguished major, my parents divorcing, ha, ha, my mother's secret apartment, plastic smell of burnt out headphones, ha, 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 diploma, ha, 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 library where I cried for a year, and ha, financial aid where I cried for 2, ha, ha, my aide disbursing a few late coins, ha, cutting my hair and crying, ha, ha, my grandfather laid out in his black suit, his collar pinched too high on his neck. Remember in Camelot how the great thorn trees wept, words and blood, ha, ha. In Camelot, the great thorn trees wept over the green page of land. Remember how light dawned in chapters. There, the hems of our garments soaked in promissory rain. Deep within those snake-bright grottos, many vines bore their fruits of salt and wood, water and salt, and the smell of books. In Camelot, we cannot live without books. All of us runaways know each other by our paper cuts. Our blood inks the dark map of the mountains. Ask me if I believe in forgiveness. I do, I say, but it is rare. I believe in the rare, how some trees decay with pressure, then resurrect as jet. I believe in mineral lozenges formed in the hot black throats of pine forests, and in the hard belt pine forests make as they buckle at long last over the beloved larynx. In the theory of the beloved, the living make do with tiny lights. We wake up in the deep hours to track where the body has gone. Gem of empty air, brilliant among violets. Gem of empty air, my grandfather brilliant among violets now. Here his green shadow condenses. When I return to his room, trying to cross that door, I'm permitted only clouds and dark leaves, only blossoms and bee song. So. He made a door. So what? His gallows, gibetto or orto, made a glass lasso. Oh, astonishment of glass, oh, pain, oh, knowledge, shivering by. My little votive in this stanza, where grandfather will not stay or let me either. My grand pain won't stay or let me pull it into order. So I keep ordering my memories hard scrambled. Mine is that pool of slow gold scraped down to cheerfulness. Mine that serpentine wall, the forgetting about crying. Gold look of the air gathered between mountains. Mine too, that graduation in mud before the rotunda's bare belfry. Who knew me then, yoke in shell? In whose wagons did I ride safe in my straw nest? Neat trick, close shave. How was I the dream, the hope of the slave? How was I their dream, their hope? Born too late to know them or walk the perimeter of their graves, deep in the next county, next planet, where I couldn't read the land or speak the right words in the woods. I almost drowned in the woods. Trees turned to water. My head slurred so I couldn't tell up from down. How could they ever dream of me? That first ravenous morning on grounds, my face a bright vine twisting south, back along the way they had come to seek the dreadful light. Blooming on the hill, blade upon blade upon blade, I think of flowers in their living labs. I know about scars. They become petals falling over the door. A door, a jaw, salt sharp and strange. But remember the heart, its red swivel. Remember the great thorn trees of Camelot. I do, I say, but they were rare, gems of violence, brilliant in space. Camelot will not stay or let me either. How am I the one they dreamed? I go dreadful, seeking an inland light. Thank you. It's quite rare for me to read that, so thanks for listening to it. I've actually maybe only read it in its entirety twice. Now for some selections from Bright. And this is technically a memoir of prose and not poetry. However, you'll quickly hear and see that this is the memoir that a poet writes. So it's something of a hybrid, and so there will be some lyrical passages. The Mirror. You don't need white people's approval to be happy, the Mirror said. But if you want anything from their world, they have to like you. Bright is an American slang term for light-skinned people of black and white ancestry. It's not a compliment. From an early age, I understood how bright applies to me, to my skin, to the face I show the world. I am fair for a black girl, powdery pale, especially in winter. It's hard to love bright, the sly, knowing way its lone syllable sidles up. Bright gets too close too soon, thinking it knows all about me. To be frank, there's a mean smile in the word. Light, bright, and damn near white goes the rhyme. F those light brights goes another. As soon as I enter the classroom, as soon as I put my books on the lectern, as soon as I begin speaking, those who don't like bright don't like me, and I can feel it. So what? The Maiden. She felt her brightness for the first time when it turned and stood inside of her. In 1771, Thomas Jefferson wrote of Monticello, I have here but one room, which, like the cobbler's, serves me for parlor, for kitchen and hall. I may add, for bedchamber and study too. What if my brightness is a house, a place to enter? Monticello, with its skull-white dome, the mansion Jefferson never stopped building. In my journal, I write, but when Jefferson dreams, he does not dream of me. Jefferson begins notes on the state of Virginia this way. Query 1, an exact description of the limits and boundaries of the state of Virginia. Most of the first paragraph is a single sentence set off with semicolons. In this way, Jefferson divides Virginia from Maryland, Maryland from Pennsylvania, and the Algonquin town of Sincock from the mouth of the Potomac River. This is how he describes the shape of Virginia as it was in the 1780s. An area somewhat triangular of 121,525 square miles. A commonwealth floats up from the matrix of Jefferson's imagination, our magic 8-ball fortune. Jefferson is the shadow I can't quite catch, hard white glint in the mirror of my own brightness. We both loved books. We both traveled to France and Italy. Jefferson's handwriting in the margins of his personal copy of notes is surprisingly legible, flowing alternately in English, French, Italian, Latin, Spanish, and Greek. He writes in a small, rounded hand, each letter exactly the same size as the others. There are times when my literacy crosses his, a sunbeam settling over the page in special collections. The cottage. Her name meant dweller. It was a name for dark places, for the shaded streams that course through the woods. My African ancestors arrived in Virginia in chains on ships that maneuvered their way up the Rappahannock River from the Chesapeake Bay, and before that from West African ports like Bonny and Old Calabar. As soon as they stepped from the first ship, their African names surge back over the Atlantic, dissolving from my view. Jefferson's prose, his graphical tables measuring rainfall and the diameters of carriage wheels, draws a fine grid over the past. Still, I crave to see my ancestors in robes and crowns. I want to know if there's some message for me stitched along the hems of their garments. In notes, Jefferson is ravenous too. His eyes range across the map along each river. He searches for slugs of amethyst beneath the earth. Jefferson's writing contains so much that I love about words, syntax, meter, image. In Query 6, trees coalesce into an elegant verticality of sound. Black oak, Quercus nigra, white oak, Quercus alba, red oak, Quercus rubra, willow oak, Quercus phellos, chestnut oak, Quercus prinus, blackjack oak, Quercus aquatica. A Jeffersonian catalog is more than a fixed container. It's a musical system that transmits his intentions. Jefferson used his literacy to solidify the abstraction of Virginia. For whom did this place become real when he wrote it? Why do I want Jefferson's blessing? Why do I want him to like me? I wish he would wish me well in his 6 languages. In 1770, Jefferson argued before the General Court of Virginia on behalf of a mixed-race man, Samuel Howell, who had sued for his freedom on the grounds that his grandmother was a white woman. Jefferson wrote, "Under the law of nature, all men are born free. Everyone comes into the world with a right to his own person, which includes the liberty of moving and using it as his own will." He lost the case. But Jefferson would use this argument several years later in the Declaration of Independence. By then, though, he would mean only white men. In his public writings, Jefferson would insist on the inferiority of black and mixed-race people, even as he fathered children with Sally Hemings, even as he relied on the people he treated as property to care for his house, his farms, his family. Scansion is the practice of measuring and describing metrical patterns in poetry, but you can apply its principles to any word. In one of my favorite teaching activities, I have students scan their own names to find the music in them. Thomas, for example, is a trochee because of its long first syllable and short final syllable. The inverse of a trochee is an iamb, a pattern some believe goes back to the patterns of Anglophone speech or even the da-dum of a beating heart. But a trochee is a dancer. It has roots in the Greek term trochaios paus, the running or spinning foot. Thomas, Kiki, Thomas. We know Jefferson suffered as he began writing notes. In June 1781, the British invaded Virginia, forcing him to flee Monticello in the final days of his governorship. Time wastes too fast. Just a few months later, Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson copied this sentence from her sickbed. The line comes from Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy. Martha died from complications of her 7th pregnancy. There's no known portraits of her, only scraps of paper like this one, bits of her handwriting, which Jefferson reportedly carried close to his person. Did writing about Virginia help pull Jefferson up from sorrow? Did he place his symmetrical catalogs, his marvelous litanies of plants and animals, against the solemn register of his losses? Last time I visited Monticello, I stood at the door of a replica slave cabin and looked up and down the slope. From there, I could just see the main residence, a curve half hidden in the trees. So many of my black ancestors couldn't read or write. I know only pieces of their lives. Yet in Virginia, their collective presence is very close to me, nearly palpable. I think of this passage from Query 7 of Notes. Going out into the open air in the temperate and warm months of the year, we often meet with bodies of warm air, which passing by us in 2 or 3 seconds do not afford time to the most sensible thermometer to write their temperature. Judging from my feelings only, I think they approach the ordinary heat of the human body. Some of them, perhaps, go a little beyond it. And I'll just end with going back to White Blood. I'll end with a poem called Psalm, which I wrote a few years ago after there was a terrible incident of gun violence at a shooting in Louisville, Kentucky, where I spent the first part of my academic career. It's dedicated to the victims of that tragedy. But I read it here tonight in dedication for all victims of gun violence, and especially to the 3 young athletes that we lost at the University of Virginia this weekend. Psalm. Dear Lord, dear high remembrancer, dear providential love, have mercy. Have mercy, thou surveyor of wildflowers, assessor of royal and exquisite bee realms. Have mercy, ledger, who tracks us in the night, who measures without speaking our dark trespasses. For nothing here survives, not the gold-legged deer browsing the bleached office park at dawn, nor the minute finch on her branch of long division, but thou, absorb it all. O gazer, be kind in thy absorbing calculus. Won't be long before thy reckoning curve arrives at the junction of our error. How, beneath thy mineral eye, we walk abroad, forgetting thee, cartographer of sparrows. Thank you.
Hello? Hi. Hi. I feel, I don't know, like I'm about to sing karaoke to you all. This is nice. I'm so honored and thrilled to be here and to be in conversation with Kiki, whose work I've really admired for a long, long time. Also, like Izzy, a little terrified to be in your presence talking about your work, but very excited. So hello, all of you. I'm so glad that we're here together. Yeah, I'm a little old school, so I have my notes in a journal, a handwritten journal. And so I think I'm gonna hop around like that. What I first wanted to talk about is a quote from Bright, where Kiki, you write, "To write a poem is to assert one's attachment to the materiality of language, but it also requires the poet to assume the open-handed posture of a questioner." I love that. And I was interested, of course, there's so much research in these poems, and there's a lot of questioning. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that, about how questions propel you through poems, to the poem, deeper, I think, into the poems. And I'm curious about what the vehicle or the form of the poem leads you, like how that mode of writing leads you to new knowing or greater mystery. How do you find the act of writing a poem an act of questioning? I want to hear more about that. I know that many of my students, I think, want to have an answer when they show up to the poem, and I'm curious about that journey for you.
Yeah, that's like a wonderful question, and for me, a poem is a way to ask questions. It's a way to think in deep ways about problems, about questions, and about mysteries. And I probably come to the posture of a questioner because of the early education that I had and the upbringing that I had within the Roman Catholic Church. it's quite a hierarchical faith, and there's a lot of structured ways that especially young people are taught about the faith, and then ways that you need to like express or practice that faith. There's a prayer for everything. There's a patron saint for everything, and for towns, and for situations. And I grew up, in particular, my Italian grandmother was quite devout in her prayer practice, and so she had like a stack of prayer cards, and each one had a different saint on them, and she would like pray in a certain sequence, and address her prayers in particular to specific saints or to the Blessed Mother. And, in a way, it's comforting to have that kind of structure, in the same way that it's comforting in a way, or at least stabilizing, to have the fixity of a poetic form when you are confronting the blank page. If you're like, well, I'm writing number 8 in my heroic sonnet crown, you know that you're not necessarily having to make something up from thin air. But at the same time, and this happened to me, growing up within a religious faith, and also having been educated in like a parochial school system, it's like I had tons of questions for which there were no set answers. And asking those questions kind of put me outside the limit of like what was kind of acceptable to ask about or to express. My overall question is always like, what happens when life overspills the boundaries of what was thought of and goes beyond that, And I think that that's not necessarily a scary thing, that there could actually be revelation, that there could actually be creation, that there could be astonishment and wonder that comes from asking questions about a mystery, And in fact, in praying the rosary, there are these certain kinds of rosaries you can pray where you pray the joyful mysteries, or what are the other ones? The sorrowful mysteries, and all the mysteries have to do with like events in the life of Christ, The joyful mysteries are like the joyful events in the life of Christ. The sorrowful mysteries have to do with the crucifixion. The glorious mysteries have to do with like the resurrection and stuff like that. But they're all mysteries, not just stories, because they have to do with the relationship that we have to the divine, So even though I just said all this stuff, I'm not speaking as like somebody that's a religious scholar, or even a person that considers myself part of any kind of church. But like when you grow up in those kinds of structures, they still are palpable for you or for me even afterwards. And so that kind of informs my approach to poetry as well.
Yeah, I love that. I'm thinking they actually have it on a different page. You have a quote also in Bright where you said, within poetry is a kind of divinity, one that requires me to listen with my human ears to its human voice. I'm very interested in how faith appears in your work, but not always, I think there's, like you said, the sort of, it doesn't really escape you, or you can't really leave that kind of lens, I think, even if it's not always, coming from, I think, a place of active worship, but that way of seeing, yeah.
Yeah, that way of seeing, but also the ways in which it serves and does not serve one's life.
Absolutely.
And one's creative practice.
Absolutely, yeah. Can we talk a little bit about form? My students right now are studying forms. That's what we're doing this semester. But I'm really interested in your relationship to it. It's how I first actually came to encounter your work, was a lot of your formal poems. I'm someone who loves form also. And I'm interested in how you came to begin writing in form, and if there's ever been any resistance to it. I guess I know my own resistance as a student of color when I was studying poetry was that the forms that I had been taught and the examples had been predominantly by white men. And I'm interested in your relationship to form, in particular, these very canonical forms like the heroic sonnet, like a sonnet, to work in that form, I think is a profound choice, and I'm very interested in how you've experienced that as you've developed as a writer and continued writing.
Yeah, another really wonderful question. So when I was a young poet, so when I was in high school writing poetry, and when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Virginia, I of course, had a literary education that emphasized historical periodization. I don't know how it is at Smith, but I had to take, these big literature surveys that started with Beowulf and went all the way to, at that point, the last thing we read, it was a sequence of 3 classes. It was from Beowulf to the novel Trainspotting.
What a
And
journey.
in between was everything in order, in historical, in chronological order. So of course, a lot of that literature made use of fixed forms in the Anglophone tradition, but then also forms like the sonnet or the villanelle that came into English in a historical context. I also minored in Italian when I was an undergraduate, so I was able to study Italian poetry, including Dante, and understand a little tiny bit about that poetic and literary tradition, which also represents the other half of my heritage. So, but in my own poetry, I didn't write in fixed or received forms. I pretty much always wrote poems in what I would have called free verse at that point. And I think that I just felt a little bit intimidated by the massiveness of literary tradition and its relationship to those kinds of forms. And I didn't know if I could write a sonnet, let alone hundreds of sonnets, which I saw someone like Shakespeare doing, for example. I didn't know if I could write an epic poem. I wasn't necessarily interested in writing some kind of epic poem the way that Dante did, or even something like Beowulf, but I really loved reading all that stuff. What I really liked about poetry as a young poet, and even into today, is repetition and incantation, and the ways that repetition allows you to cast a spell over the reader and capture the attention of the reader, and also allows you to introduce an idea and then vary it later. So as I developed as a poet, I slowly came to I slowly came to feel empowered enough to try out my own takes on certain forms. And in my 3rd book of poetry, I wrote over a dozen villanelles, for example. With regard to the sonnet, there's many exciting contemporary African American poets that have sort of renewed and refreshed the sonnet, and Terrence Hayes is one of those poets. But there's many others who are using the sonnet as a kind of investigatory form, a form to talk not only about romantic relationships or love or even divinity, but also about history and about different legacies for which the sonnet is actually conducive because of its highly concentrated size and its really resonant scope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you, this is even just for a selfish craft question that I'm curious about. I'm curious about the sequence and writing happiness and how you came to write it, what that was, how you actually went down and did that. Did you write first the last sonnet, or did you kind of discover it? How long did that sequence take you? I'm really interested in it, and it is a substantial section of the book. Just curious, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for listening to that whole double sonnet.
It was great. That was amazing. I'm so
yeah.
glad you read that.
That sonnet crown came together in a really feverish period of time in the summer of 2017. I wrote those sonnets in the immediate aftermath of the Unite the Right rally and all that had happened in Charlottesville at that time. I was not in Charlottesville on that day. I didn't even know that I would eventually work at the University of Virginia as a professor. I was a professor at the University of Louisville. I was thinking about writing this book, White Blood. I was thinking at that time that I would only write about the historical aspects of Virginia by looking at my own genealogy, by writing about my grandmother's life and her mother, and the fact that that side of my family all come from small rural counties in central and northern Virginia. So I thought it would be kind of stepping back into the past and looking at Virginia only through like a documentary, poetry, or historically researched lens. So I started in that way, but then everything happened in 2017, and much like everybody, I was seeing it all happen on TV. But for me, the landscape that I saw being riven in that event was a landscape that was very familiar to me. The lawn where those men were marching with torches was the lawn where I visited my friends and hung out with them. It was the place where I had gone to my classes. It was the place where I accepted my diploma when I graduated. And I realized at that time that the book I was writing also had to include my connections to Virginia. Like I was thinking, I had already kind of written myself out of my own book while I was still working on it. And I had to give myself permission to be in my own book in this way. And so I realized that I had not ever written in poetry about my experience of being at the university as one of few Black students. Like, what is it like to be an out-of-state student at a big state university? What is it like to be a student on significant financial aid and scholarships when other people were not, maybe? My parents divorcing in the middle of my time as an undergraduate, and my grandfather taking his own life, unfortunately, was in that same year. All that stuff happened in my second year. And what's weird is that personally, I just kind of like had to swallow hard and just like move on and move past those personal losses. But just like I was saying about, religious education and things like that, those experiences still stayed with me. I didn't know how to write about them, or I wasn't ready to write about them. After 2017, I felt like I was ready to write about them, and the sonnet sequence kind of poured out at that point. So it was actually a really different experience from any other group of poems that I've ever written for that reason.
That's fascinating. I'm thinking about a lot of things. Something that I was thinking about that I just see in your work is layers. It's as if, in reading both Bright and White Blood, there's this sense of, the present moment, and then seeing through or maybe across, like place and time, into seeing like all of the people who have been in this place previously. How does it all relate to one another, and where do I find myself in this lineage that exists, that it's not gone, and if you stop for a second and see through, it's all there, it's all still there. I know when reading these books, and in particular I think White Blood, I was thinking about how these things jut up against each other in ways that are often unsettling. The word that kind of came to mind to me at first was luxury, like thinking about tourism and souvenirs and sort of the beauty, surface beauty, but the sort of beauty that exists in these places of great horror. And I was just, I guess, interested in how you peel back those layers, how you see poetry as a way to sort of hold all these moments at once. I don't know, maybe if there's, I know that we talked a little bit about commerce too, and thinking about commerce in these places. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that, for me it seems uncanny and very eerie, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think, and I was speaking about this with a friend earlier today, I'm slowly starting to understand that actually think time is linear. I think that we experience it in this linear way, but a lot of the reasons why the passage of time feels unsatisfying, or that we have trouble accepting grief and loss and things like that, is because we only have this experience of being inside of a body or something, steering a body across this like linear landscape of time. But I actually don't think that time works that way. If you are a poet, you can feel that time is much more layered and complex than that, than just a straight line. And when you're in a place like Virginia, and I'm sure that you can experience this in New England as well, especially as a person of color and as a poet, when I go to a place like Monticello, I feel the currents of the past very strongly. I know that there was tragedy and loss and horror that was experienced there, but there was also family life, birth, marriage, community, and spirituality, and nature, like all of those things were also experienced there, and I sense those things when I'm in that space. There's a lot of people that don't want to go to a place like Monticello. They wouldn't want to go to Manassas Battlefield, another place that's important to me, because some of my family members some of my ancestors were free Black people farming on land that became part of the battlefield eventually. They don't want to go places like that because they can feel the pain coming out of the land. And I can feel that too. But I also feel the everythingness that is there. And as a poet, I want to be where those currents are running the strongest. And it's not enough to say that I like being there or that I enjoy it. A lot of times it's not enjoyable. It's not something that you can like. But it's a place that I have to be, to be at a nexus of different energies, so that I can understand that nothing is actually hidden. Like, even when I am at UVA walking across the campus or grounds, there's a layer that is my previous life there, which is the 4 magical years I spent there as a student. The Gap khaki clad ghost of me from the 90s wearing a choker is still traversing that landscape, and I encounter her on a regular basis, and it's actually not something to fear or avoid. Like, it's something to experience, and I think appreciate about being in a place, to being open to listening and trying to and perceiving the different levels of existence that a place can express.
Yeah. I love that your ghost self is still there. I like the idea of the previous selves, and I think it is fascinating the ways that you've come back to these places and how they've been constants in your life. I'm always interested in, like, where are the moments in time where I will be again in the future, and or places where I've returned to the past, and wondering if I could see all of the time that I might be in a place, what that would look like. It's a thought that thrills me. I thought it was interesting what you had said earlier about permission and the permission to include yourself in the poems. One of the quotes I'd written down is, "What I don't like about my brightness, how it gets to be a surface where others feel invited to view themselves. In others' gazes, I lose my privacy." And I'm thinking about, this is a very intellectual book. It's a lot of research, and I greatly respect and admire that research. It's also a very vulnerable book, and I was curious. I think for myself, I'm terrified of nonfiction, and I think it's because I can't hide as much in nonfiction. There's no phantom speaker. It's kind of self as speaker. And I was curious about, this is your first book of nonfiction. What did nonfiction allow you to say differently, I guess, because there are similar threads that go through both. I was curious about, was that written simultaneously alongside White Blood? Was it written afterward? And how did that form maybe take take you, into further into that line of gaze, and maybe in other ways allow for other kinds of things to come to the surface.
Yeah, I wrote, before Bright, I was primarily a poet who would publish the occasional essay, the occasional short essay. And I really, wanted to work more with the essay form and with nonfiction as a genre, because I so admire what contemporary essayists are doing, especially women and women and non-binary essayists. What can be done in the essay form, in the paragraph, But I also can't approach subject matter. I can't really approach like the idea of a memoir from a scholarly standpoint. It's always going to be associative. I'm always going to try to tie seemingly disparate threads together. I want to tell you a story about something, but then I also want to let you in on some memory material, or I want to focus really tightly on this like blade of grass really quick. And so that's kind of how I am as a poet also. So I knew that would come out in prose. The subject of Bright is, it's in very, very broad terms. It's about identity, and it's about how do you claim your own identity as a unified human being when you exist in a society that wants to put you on one side of a binary or the other. As a Black American of mixed race ancestry, like, I have to say a mouthful every time I want to like identify myself, and I need to establish that in a really confident way, or else the outside world will decide for me where it wants me to go. Especially in America, where racial hierarchies were determined based on the optical markers of racial identity, and where, colorism also just like reified, these really harmful systems of white supremacist like oppression. I come into confrontation like on a daily basis with the world in the body that I am in, and depending on who I'm talking to and who's interacting with me, I could be put into a box, and I've even had people say, like, when I first met you, I thought you were blah, blah, blah because you look like XYZ to me. And then another person will say, well, I thought she was blah, blah, blah because she looks like this to me. And it's like, I'm here, And I don't want to focus on what I look like. I just want everybody to interact with me as a human being who has the right and the ability to define myself. But I still understand that is an uphill battle, and that is something that I have to work towards in each interaction. So some of that fairy tale material that I put in is a way of getting some of that, of talking about the outside-inside aspect, the outside-inside feeling of what it's like to occupy this type of existence. You know?
Kiki, I want to talk to you all night, but I think that we're probably coming close. But I want to ask one kind of joyful question. I hope so. I'm interested in, life as a writer, how one sustains themselves across not just one poem or one book, but a career, a life, builds a life as a writer. And these two books are brilliant. They came out, 2 years apart from each other. I know you're working on your third. I'm interested in what has sustained you, in projects that I think require a lot of intellectual and emotional labor. How do you kind of nurture yourself and care for yourself when doing all that work, but also, of course, being a living person who, I think it's clear to me, it seems that there is a lot of joy, I think, in your work, and even in your use of forms feels sometimes quite joyful, I think, and playful to me. And I'm curious about that, like what pushes you and carries you through some of these projects of intensity or the feverish points maybe.
Well, I feel like I've been really lucky because I have had a supportive family and home life as an adult. And my mom has been very important person when it comes to writing these poems that have to do with our family and with our genealogy. She supervised me on my research, and she still is my supervisor and travel companion on some of my research trips. So being able to share your work with somebody that you know is going to support your work and be waiting for that next poem, whether it's a friend or a family member, that's really important. I have a wonderful husband who is a visual artist, and so we get to have interesting conversations across each of our art forms, and to have someone else who also is involved in the creative arts, like listen and kind of give ideas and give reassurance. Like, I think that that's really important. I used to be, I still am kind of a workaholic in a sense that it can be hard for me to always affect the boundary that I need between my working life and my creative life. But over the past few years, I've been working hard to make sure that my teaching and my writing work occupy related but distinct spheres, you know, so that I can put all the energy into my teaching when I'm teaching, and then be able to reset at home, and then come back and read and work on creative work. So it's kind of about creating appropriate and healthy boundaries for one's life. The other answer is cats, or any kind of animal friend. I think that for me, like about 4 years ago, we adopted our 2 cats, and honestly, they've made our lives better. There's something about having the friendship of a little creature that reminds you of of our connections to the planet, and caring for creatures, and making sure that they have what they need to be happy in their way of being happy is a way to grow one's empathy. And yeah, I've just loved it.
I think that's a great note to end on. We love cats. This is a pro-cats reading. I certainly am very fond of cats. Thank you so much, Kiki. Kiki's going to be signing books over at this table. Please go get your book signed. And can we give Kiki a big round of applause? Because that was fantastic.